jump on when they come in. My name's Mark Scorsone. I'm the Assistant Director for United States Ministry under Joe Jensen. And like I said, Joe is over on the Facebook page, connecting with people over there. So we got kind of a dual thing happening. We did it last month with Pastor Chris's Huddle, and it worked pretty well, trying to incorporate as many people as possible. But I want to welcome you. Thank you for signing up for this Huddle here. It's the first of 3 with Garry. I met Garry probably in the fall when he was speaking at the Lancaster retreat with John Young. And just the topic he's going to be discussing here is just such a hot topic as church leaders, even in youth ministry and kids and the whole 9 yards. So I'm excited. I've been talking with Garry a little bit here and there, just trying to get his heart on just what he's going to be sharing. And I think it's just going to be really informational, really practical, and really encouraging for us as leaders, and just how to best equip some of the folks that we're working with and that God brings through their doors of our church. And so come up with your questions. We'll have some Q&A time at the end. But I'm just really excited for Garry to be here. He's going to also be at the other 3 huddles that we're going to have here, one next month and one again in April. And then he's going to be with us for the Youth and Kids Leaders Summit in March 20 and 21. So all of you that are in Zoom, you'll be a part of a drawing at the end for 2 free registrations to that to the summit here with Garry in March. And if some of you win it and you're not planning on coming, you can let me know and I will pass it along to somebody else that might be interested in coming. But we'll have some time for Q&A at the end. I just want to turn it over to Brother Garry. Just really want to have him just introduce himself and just the path, the journey that got him here. And just so thankful for your ministry, Pastor Garry, and just your heart. When I heard your heart in the fall there, I just said I knew I needed to get you in front of my youth and kids leaders. So just really enjoyed getting to know you here these past few months, and just to go ahead and share your heart a little bit.
Sure. Thanks so much, Mark. Thanks for everybody to carve some time out of your schedule just to be here. So in terms of sharing my heart, I guess what I would start off by saying is I started this ministry, my wife and I, called Love and Truth Network about 7 years ago or so, coming up on that. And prior to that, I had been on staff at a large church in the Binghamton, New York area for about 12 years. And then, and my wife is a licensed Christian counselor, both in New York as well as here in Arizona now. And I mean, our heart in starting the ministry is just recognizing that while there are some churches that are being really effective in the way that they're ministering in the area of relational and sexual wholeness or brokenness and restoring wholeness, they're not many. And that's an area that we tend to not talk about at all. Or if we do, it might be just like a sermon series once a year, or many churches kind of stumble over the topics and tend to produce more shame than actually transformation. And so we love the church. God rescued our lives through the church. So it's not anything about, just either bashing the church or developing a nonprofit and I have some people that I know that are frustrated with the church, and they basically have developed their own nonprofit, and essentially it's kind of siphoning people away from the church into what they're doing. And that's not at all what we believe. I loved being a pastor. I love the church. And so we just want to strengthen the church in this area, because we know if the church can become healthy in the area of restoring relational and sexual wholeness, it can launch so much in terms of the integrity of the church and the vitality of the church. And I think many people are going to be drawn to Christ through authentic relationship and authenticity around sexuality. So anyway, that's a little bit. Our main focus is on equipping the church, not working with individual strugglers. I love to do that a bit. I love to do that a lot, but if I say yes to individual meetings, I'm saying no to working with leaders and helping them develop the environments that are truly transformational. So
cool. Garry, didn't you pastor for several years before starting this ministry? And Gary's ministry is Love and Truth Network, which I'm sure he's going to elaborate a little bit more on that. But what led you to start your ministry here?
So the main reasons, just I came to that church in upstate New York from Chicago. I'd kind of traveled all around the country and had been in kind of running mode. Every time things would get difficult or boring or whatever, I'd kind of pick up and move to another state, and just really got into a big mess in Chicago. Even though I grew up in the church, I in a Christian home. I realized early on that I was experiencing same-sex attraction at an early age. I'd been exposed to hardcore porn at the age of 5 or 6 by some older neighborhood boys and some of their homosexual behavior as well. And so when I, certainly even before puberty, but certainly when I hit puberty, I was very much immediately a porn addict, and just really caught up in a lot of deep sense of shame, and yet compulsive in kind of, living that out. And so when the Lord brought me to this church in upstate New York, in the area that I grew up in, they were unusual. I've been to many churches around the country, and this place was unusual in that they were really open about the kind of transforming work that they were doing, and the kind of brokenness that they were inviting people to come out of. So they were talking openly about sex before marriage and about adultery and how to work through that. And they were working with people coming through substance abuse and a variety of things. And I was, I would come back to the area that I lived in, and I would visit this church periodically. And I realized, there's something really different about this place. And so one day I just asked the pastor for his email address. And in my life in Chicago, while I was doing really well professionally, it had devolved into adult bookstores and gay bars, and that's what my social life entailed. And I basically put all this into an email and just said I was desperate for help and support. And the pastor invited me to move back. He said, if you want to move back here, we'll walk with you. And that alone was miraculous, that he even wanted to do that. So
what year was that, just to give a timeline?
Yeah, so that was probably, I think that was around 1999. Wow. So we're talking 20 years ago. And so I moved back. I got into counseling right away. They had a pretty decent lay counseling program. I got into a small group right away, and then eventually joined their men's group, which that for me was the last place on earth I wanted to be, because all of my shaming, all of my emotional abuse, at least, really came through the world of men and boys. And I felt like I was really isolated and pushed out of that as a boy. And so the last place on earth I wanted to be was in a Christian men's group. So I can tell a little bit more about my story beyond that. But when I got there and I experienced a lot of healing, we really felt like after 12 years of working on staff at this church, my wife and I felt like, the Lord really is giving me the boot out of my comfortable nest, and to take this ministry beyond the four walls of our church into not just the region of the Northeast, but even nationally.
Wow, that's quite a journey. You wanted to focus on this whole topic of divide and conquer, and the schemes that mar our maleness and femaleness, and just you want to get into that a little bit of just how you started.
Sure. I think there are so many ways that the enemy, the enemy has been around for since the beginning, at least of our human experience, and of course, he doesn't really need to do anything new. He just has a few of the same old basic, just out of the same basic playbook. And divide and conquer is certainly one of his tactics, whether that's dividing us as male and female. Here we are made, according to Genesis 1:26 and 27, which is a foundational passage for our ministry, is that we're made male and female in his image. We believe that not only are we made human beings in God's image, but we are made male and female with distinct differences that should be celebrated. And in our culture, we're seeing not just a cry for equality, which is essential, which is true, but we're seeing a cry for sameness, that there's no distinction. And it really blurs the lines. It veils and minimizes the value of the different aspects of the image of God that are in us as male and female. And I'll just say, just to clarify, we're not even talking about roles. I think that culturally and even historically within the church, we put way too much emphasis on roles as opposed to calling, and how God calls us to live out. Many times our roles may be, men may be involved in historically cultural, more feminine activities or whatever, and women may do the same thing, and crossing into those arenas, whether it's it's cooking, or it's doing or it's being in the military, that kind of thing. But we have a unique way that we live out our roles and our experiences as male and female. So one of the primary things we've seen is that from the very beginning, Satan brought a wedge between male and female, and really put us at odds with one another. And so that's been going on forever. Misogyny, misandry, the devaluing and the hatred of the masculine and the feminine. And if we think that that just happens in culture and not in the church, we're very much mistaken. That's been a huge issue. Most women would understand that's the case, even in the church. And so there's an issue there. But we've also been divided even in regard to our own gender. And so part of what's happening these days is there's a kind of a popular sort of move and perspective, and it's happening to us in many ways unconsciously, where what my wife and I say, Melissa and I say, is that, look, God made us male and female, period. There aren't 50 some odd genders. I've read articles that talk about celebrating the reality that there's thousands of genders out there. And but God made us male and female, and he didn't make us, the fact that I experience same-sex attraction, or I come out of homosexuality, that doesn't relegate me to a subset of the male population. I'm a dude, I'm a guy, and I really needed to embrace the reality and really be welcomed in. And that's what this church did for me in the men's group. They really welcomed me into the community of men for the first time in my life. And I was in my early 30s when that happened. And so where there had been all this segregation and this pushing away, like, you're gay, you're different than us. And instead they're saying, you know what, you're one of us. And yeah, you deal with some things that many of us don't, but we know what it's like to have a pornography addiction. One guy said, I know what it's like to lose a marriage because of adultery. And so, we want you to walk this journey with us, and we want to walk it with you. And so that really began this, a path toward healing for me in terms of who I am as a man. And so we have the male female split in terms of divide and conquer. We have the split in terms of our own gender, where we look at others as being different than us, and we tend to not want to have anything to do with them. Heterosexual guys that have never experienced same-sex attraction or gender dysphoria or any of that, can often sort of look at those of us who have and really want there to be a wide line of demarcation, lest anybody ever think that we ourselves, are too needy, are too, may in some ways have same-sex attraction, or we want to be as far away from that as possible. And so again, it's this sort of pushing and this polarizing of who we are and the different things we struggle with, even within our own gender. So we see that also as an issue. And then I'd say just generally in the church, one of the most profound and damaging things that we see is, and it's the milieu, it's the environment of most churches, not because it's intended, but it simply happens over the course of time, is what we've realized is nearly everyone is hiding in the church. Mm-hmm. None of us are living transparent and open lives, whether it's coming out of sexual brokenness. That's certainly true in that case. I mean, none of us want to expose pornography issues or masturbation or other sexual sin areas, whether it's something we're currently involved in or something that's even historic. None of us want to expose any of that kind of stuff. But the truth is, that I just heard a pastor last week out here. One of the topics he was talking about was greed. And he said, I as a pastor, I've actually had people come to me and confess a pornography addiction. I've never had anyone come to me and actually say, I'm really struggling with greed. So whatever the case is, whether it's self-righteousness or greed or any other sin area, we struggle with things in the church that nobody else knows about. And that is so antithetical to the gospel. It's so antithetical to the way God designed us to live in community. And so that's a huge message that we have. And again, that's a major way that the enemy has divided us and has really conquered in our lives is that we all sort of know each other, in scare quotes. We know about each other. We know what we do for work. We know maybe the children's names that we have, and vice versa, and those kinds of things. But we don't know what the deep aches and hurts and wounds and sin areas are in the lives of people that we've bumped into for 20 years in our churches.
Right.
So that's a bit of it. This perspective of divide and conquer.
You mentioned that your church back in 1999 welcomed you in. That's really not the norm, right?
Right.
Especially back then. What do you see now? How the church can just really be open to the sinner, but not love the sin. I'm sure I was talking with a pastor that a couple left their church because they weren't supporting, the church wasn't supporting their daughter's choice in this area. And so it's a big deal with our churches. So what would you say to that?
Well, so what tends to be happening now, not so much back when 20 years ago, but what tends to be happening now is we still have a number of I'll use the word traditional. That's not necessary. I don't think tradition is a bad thing at all. But when tradition, what I would say is that many churches in the U.S. at least, when I think of traditional churches, they also tend to be more legalistic churches. Whether that's a Baptist church or even a Pentecostal church. I mean, we all have kind of our own different brand of legalism in a sense. And so there certainly are plenty of those churches still around, but increasingly we have younger pastors, men and women rising up who recognize that wasn't helpful. They recognize that there was a lot of, we might have used the phrase, love the sin or hate the sin. But the truth is, I mean, in all honesty, from my perspective, looking back, it wasn't just hate the sin. It was also, pretty much hate the sinner as well. We felt better in saying that, but
Sure.
we didn't know how to love the sinner in their place of brokenness either. And so what I would say is that these younger men and women rising up into church leadership and pastoring don't want to be anything like that. And so unfortunately, rather than landing in a solid place, many folks the pendulum has swung so far in the opposite direction, and now everything is approved, and or nearly everything. And particularly in the area of LGBTQ, there are churches that have evangelical roots, but they've just fully embraced a gay identity and gay marriage, even ordaining gay pastors, and seeing no issue with that. What we would say is that churches that are going to be most relevant, and there's a reason, of course, that we named our ministry Love and Truth Network, is that we really believe that churches most relevant in our culture are those that are standing on a razor's edge. I mean, there's not a lot of wiggle room around human sexuality for that for us to go one way or the other. If we're mostly focused on truth, then we can sort of become Bible thumpers and not compassionate at all. And if we're mostly focused on what's referred to at least as love, then we chuck truth out the window, and we're really in danger of preaching and delivering a false gospel that really affirms people in their sin and in their separation from Christ.
Well, it's definitely a fine line. So what would you say?
Uh-oh.
What's that?
Did I lose somebody here?
Oh, there you are. Garry, what would you say to this epidemic of the sexual brokenness within the church? How do we address that?
Well, the first and foremost, I think we've got to get real and honest about the fact that it's there. Statistically speaking, the church has massive sexual brokenness issues. When you look at statistics, and 50 to 70% of your average church-going guy is using pornography, and 20 to 30% of Christian women are looking at porn, and a lot of Christian leaders, we know that there's an epidemic, a pandemic really, of sexual brokenness, which is a cancer that is devouring the church, that's hidden, that again nobody really wants to address. So there's a real need for for us to get honest and real about it and do more than just a sermon series once a year.
Right. I mean, this might be too broad of a question, and maybe you can unpack it the way that you want, but what would you say to a church leadership team that could be more aware? Because I think the view, and I could be wrong, but I think the view that people on the outside of the church are looking at the church and saying that, you know, you're hypocritical, you're judgmental, you don't accept us. So
right. Yeah, and so what I would say, and I think there's some valid reasons for people to feel that way, honestly. Although you know, the church also is labeled in a way that is unfair and isn't fully accurate, and yet there's enough that we've done that has alienated people, that has wounded and hurt people, that there's reasons for why people feel that way. I say over and over again, our ministry doesn't focus on LGBT issues. We bring that to the conversation because I come out of that background. My wife also broke off an engagement with a man and got involved with a woman, and so she knows. Also, it felt like that was what she was looking for her whole life, was this connection with this woman. And so, you know, we understand the LGBT community, and we bring that conversation into all that we talk about. But the biggest issue in the church is not LGBT, it's heterosexual brokenness. So the way that we can effectively minister is by talking not just about LGBT issues, but by talking about sexual brokenness and connecting that also with LGBT and inviting people into this journey of wholeness and restoration that we're all on.
Right. Well, how do you even begin that conversation on discussing sexual brokenness? I mean, it's some leaders probably don't even want to touch that with a 10-foot pole because, you know.
Right. Well, I absolutely. I think that's true. I mean, one of the easiest ways for a church to do that is to bring somebody like me in. You know, there's others out there aren't many out doing specific work exclusively for churches and Christian leaders, the way that we feel like God has called us to do that. But there are others, you know, doing ministry and sharing their testimonies.
Right.
But I think bringing someone like me in can really break the ice. And, you know, I get to say things and communicate certain things in a way that people can really grasp and understand, that doesn't come across as judgmental as it would if somebody starts addressing, you know, particularly LGBT issues, who's never been there. And
Right.
so that's a good way of breaking the ice. But our whole goal is not just to swoop in and preach on a Sunday or have a weekend of ministry. Our goal is to be connected with the church and help them shift the environment. The goal here is not slap a program or slap a Band-Aid, you know, on an arm that's been ripped off. Our goal is to actually see environmental change and shift. And yes, programs can help with that. But if you're only establishing a program without really addressing the systemic environmental issues in the church, then, you know, the church stands back and largely applauds that, oh, we've got a group for those poor folk, you know, that desperately need it, not realizing that, oh my gosh, I'm one of those poor folk. Like 99% of us could actually benefit from going through some deep inner healing program work.
Right.
And the majority of us, unless the environment starts to change in the church, we just stand back and feel good about the fact that we're offering something for the drug addicted or the sex addicted or whatever. And so we've got to start the conversation, and it needs to be at the level. I mean, the idea that we are not discipling our young people as well as our adults on that we don't have a sexual discipleship program, you know, and I often show that as a slide, and we'll say, you probably have never heard or never saw those two words together in a sentence, sexual discipleship. But it is essential. Like, our kids and we as adults are being sexually discipled every single day.
Absolutely.
Every day. And the one place that is not doing a good job of sexual discipleship is the church. And yet we have the answers. So we've got to be willing to push into some of those difficult places, recognizing that sexual sin in particular is devouring our churches.
Yeah. I mean, just how do you get going? I mean, is pride a big issue here of people not wanting to just say, I have struggles in this whole area?
Sure.
I mean,
But it's pride. It's also fear. You know, there's people,
shame.
we've opened up to certain ones in the past. And so it only takes 2 or 3 really bad experiences, of a pastor that you confided in and he never asked about your struggles again, as if somehow you opening up and talking with him, somehow that must have just magically taken care of it. But really what's happening is he or she is uncomfortable and doesn't really want to talk about it. And so they're just hoping that you sort of find the help you need. And so, yeah, it's essential that we break through the ice. It's essential that I think that churches work with ministries or programs like ours to be able to address this on a holistic level. Like, for example, I'll come in and do a full weekend of ministry where I meet with teens and parents on a Friday night. Saturday may do either a public conference or maybe a conference for that church, or maybe there's other churches that are being invited into that. Sunday preach, and then afterward we'll meet for 4 or 5 hours with individuals that want to meet for 30 minutes or 45 minutes about their own personal struggles, or a mom or dad that just found out about their son or daughter is gay or trans. And we'll have those individual meetings, and then we'll meet on Monday for breakfast or lunch with pastors in the area. So we're not just coming in and leaving without there being, we want to see other pastors and churches brought into the conversation so that there's support in that particular area. And then we want to continue to be available as a resource, for that church. But breaking the ice and giving permission for people to share. One other thing I will say that I think is really profound, and I say this everywhere I go, when people ask, what's the number one thing we can do to impact the environment of our churches? What I say is the body needs to start talking. And so we need, in the beginning, if you're a church of 50, people are not going to run to the mic and the video camera to tell their story, right? That's certainly true. But you can begin, I think every Sunday, there ought to be a 3-minute, and maybe other times during the week, but a 3-minute or so video that has been edited well and talks about a variety of areas. A woman who's overcome an abortion that she had 10 or 20 years ago, a guy that's overcoming substance abuse, or a woman overcoming that, a woman overcoming or a man overcoming sexual abuse from when they were a little girl or a little boy. And, how do they walk through those things? Because that doesn't disappear simply as you add more years to that person's life. If anything, their soul becomes more and more infected until that issue is brought to the surface and until Jesus is invited in to bring healing. And so when you have this wide range of testimony, people overcoming pornography, coming out of homosexuality, and you can pull this stuff off the internet or borrow it from other churches to start with. But when you have that kind of conversation going on and people are seeing that every Sunday, oh my goodness. I mean, it starts to change the environment. People start to feel like, oh, wow, we're actually talking about these things. They start to feel like this is a different environment than what they've known for 10 or 20 or 30 years.
Wow. Yeah, Garry, if you can, would you just elaborate a little bit more? I don't know if it's showing up probably all backwards on the camera, maybe not to you guys, but yeah. Some of the things that you offer to a church. I know you talked a little bit about it, and it's great that you come in for a weekend, but you're also willing to walk with the church and with people through it. It almost sounds like an a la carte type ministry. Whatever the church needs, you'll custom fit to their needs and things like that. But
right, that's true. I'd say the word we use, Mark, is to be, and I think this gets overused, but we do want to be contextual to the church. So depending on the denomination, depending on where the church is located, whether it's urban or rural, depending on the ages of the church, they're going to be looking at different needs. But the truth is, it doesn't matter. All that I just said doesn't change the reality that every single church is facing relational and sexual brokenness on a massive scale. And so we know that's an issue. It really is just a matter of how can we approach it together. So one of my favorite things, honestly, to do, which I haven't mentioned yet, but one of my favorite things to do is to come in and usually following a conversation with a pastor over the phone or in Zoom, to be invited in to meet with the leadership team, and to open up the conversation at that level, to sit around a table, sit around a room, and sometimes even that could even be a retreat for the leaders where we start getting real and honest, and there's someone there who's comfortable with guiding the conversation and helping them to open up about where they're at personally. It's amazing. how leaders oftentimes assume that they know all about the people that they work with on a regular basis in ministry. And when we start these conversations, they realize, wow, we really do have different views about this. Or I didn't know that you had a niece or nephew or a son and daughter who's in the LGBT community. And, and that you really, you have a vested interest in these areas. So the leadership team meeting, I think, is really essential. I hate going into a church without having laid the foundation of some of those opportunities to meet, right, and have deep and lengthy discussion. Because if the leaders aren't buying into this, and the leaders aren't recognizing the need to shift the environment of their churches, right, then it's just going to be, me coming in or my wife coming in and doing a weekend of ministry or preaching on a Sunday, and then Monday morning they're on to the next thing, the next sermon series, or Dave Ramsey's Financial Peace, which is awesome, right, by the way. But sexual brokenness needs to be dealt with in a way that doesn't just, it's not this modular thing that just fits in with everything else. It's this all-encompassing, every man, every woman, every boy, every girl is dealing with, how in the world do I steward who I am as a sexual being and as a being made in the image of God, male or female? How do I steward that? And again, the church is just not addressing it at all.
Yeah, this is really some good stuff, Gary. Because I know you speak to kids, teens, parents, and all the way up to top leadership, and so it's you got to be pretty well-rounded with communicating to all this dynamical generational group here. But what would you say, like if someone comes out of this type of lifestyle and things like that, what's the holding power? What keeps them from going back? Do you see a big decline? Is there, I mean, like in any addiction, I had a brother-in-law that struggled, was clean for 3 years, and then fell even harder and
Yep.
lost his life over it. So what are some of the things that you're seeing?
Well, at the end of the day, I think that sexual sin and sexual addiction and oftentimes other forms of addiction, but particularly sexual ones, I think almost always, and I would say perhaps not always, but nearly always, sexual sin and brokenness is rooted in relational brokenness. Like there's nothing more powerful, or there's nothing that is a bigger counterfeit to authentic intimacy than sexual immorality. So, so that's why sexual immorality becomes so addictive. Even if it's just with oneself, the screen of a computer or what have you, or it's with others, there's this false sense of intimacy, which frankly we're starving for. And so in many ways we behave like a bulimic individual who refuses to eat, and again, we're talking emotional. And so when Hebrews 3 talks about the fact that we are supposed to encourage one another day after day, as long as it's still called today, so that our hearts are not hardened by the deceitfulness of sin. The truth is, how often are any of us being encouraged at that level? Think about the repetitiveness of what the writer of Hebrews is communicating there. Encourage one another day after day, every single day, as long as it's still called today, throughout the day. We need to have encouragement the way that we eat food, and none of us get that. We're getting crumbs. We're ashamed of our needs oftentimes, and so very seldom have we learned to ask for what we need and communicate what those emotional needs are, and as a result of that, we tend to live in emotional patterns of binging and purging. Which is kind of part of the cycle of addiction. But we go without for so long, and then we binge, and we turn to junk food. We turn to the thing that our hearts are aching, we're desperate, we're empty, and we turn to sexual sin, and then and wonder why we keep doing that. Well, it's largely, of course, there's lust involved, but largely there are wounds in our lives that have never been healed. We're so hungry for a relationship. We were made for a relationship. The relational needs that we have are legitimate needs given to us by God, and yet we don't know how to really embrace those and accept those. And so we're a microwave culture that wants everything in an instant, and so that's what we tend to do, is we chuck I think that we really live out of both a kind of logical intellectual knowledge and understanding, which is, it's what the truths of Scripture, the verses that we've memorized, but we have experiential understanding too, at more of a heart level. And those experiences oftentimes totally disagree with what we know to be true in our heads, what we know to be true theologically. And so when we're, angry, hungry, lonely, tired, bored, stressed, whatever, we get triggered in some fashion, and we will chuck what we know for a moment, and we'll turn to the experience that tends to give us that boost or lift, and yet over time it's devouring us. So I think it's rooted largely in the deprivation of emotional and relational connectedness, which again goes back to the divide and conquer that the enemy has been very successful to accomplish in our lives.
Right. Well, this is awesome. We're going to open it up here for some Q&A here in a second. Garry, is there anything you want to elaborate on, or just something that you might want to go back to, or is there anything you want to just leave us before we open up with Q&A?
Yeah, there's one thought that comes to my mind, just to kind of explain what I was just talking about a little bit more. I mean, I've been in a number of men's groups. I'm so thankful for men's groups, but I've been in a number of men's groups and kind of around how women's groups operate. I think we make a big assumption in the church that, and rightly so, on some level, that women just naturally gravitate toward relationship easier than men. But what I've found to be true, and my wife as well, is that women's groups have the appearance of, and I think some reality of being deeper relationally, and yet they also hit a wall where women oftentimes don't trust other women, where they will only go so far. They're not really opening up about those deep things. It's easier for them to kind of be relational in a sense. But what I would say, when I'm talking about this need, it's not just finding a kind of a typical men's group or women's group and just being a part of that. Women's groups and men's groups and small groups need to go far deeper. One of the things I advocate a lot is that every man that's a follower of Jesus needs a band of brothers who knows everything about him, and he knows everything about that band of brothers. And every woman who's a follower of Jesus needs a band of sisters who knows everything about her, and she knows everything about them. It's this inner circle that we're doing life with. It's this inner circle where there's something incredibly healing and restorative when we have people looking us in the face who know the good and the bad and the ugly, which we all want to keep the most of the bad and all the ugly in the background where nobody knows about it. But when they know that whole thing, and yet they still love us, or maybe they even love us more because of our willingness to be known and fully kind of disclose the whole person to them. When we experience that, many of us experience what it is to be loved for the first time. Because when all we are is loved for all of the good things about ourselves, or the nice person that we are, or the wonderful Christian we are, and we know that there's a whole bunch of crap in the background, that love, it just washes right through us. There's no container to hold it. And so again, our capacity, we need to go far deeper and be more relationally connected, even in our men's and women's groups, for the relational needs that we have. So with that, happy to take questions.
Yeah, that's really good. I was listening to a video from Chip Ingram, probably no relation to you.
I know, I wish he were, but he's not.
But he was saying pretty much the same thing, that we really are missing that going deep, guys with guys that really know everything about us, and same with the ladies, and why it's such a struggle in our church culture. But you know,
well, and when you think about it, Mark, and when Jesus says that they will know you by the love you have for one another, like what we do now, what the typical church experience that we have, we're nice to each other in a sense, but I think people in the world will be drawn to Jesus and know that we're followers of him when they see more of that radical transparency and the love that's exchanged, and the way that we have one another's back, even in those places, or especially in those places. That's when I think the world is drawn, and they are drawn to it. They're hungry for it too. They just don't want some veneer of religion. They want the real deal.
And when they see the people walk in the freedom of it, that's just more of a connection to, wow, that really did break off of them, and it's not fake or a facade. Yep. And that's where the real rubber meets the road. So go ahead, Luke, go ahead and unmute our gang out there. Thank you, everybody, for listening. This is really good stuff, wasn't it? Just provoking and challenging. And so if you can, if you guys can unmute yourselves, go ahead and try to do that as well. What's that, Joe?
It's best if they unmute when they talk. Everybody else stays muted.
Yeah, unmute when you talk, and then we'll go.
Otherwise, you get a lot of background noise.
Any questions to start off there? I know that
I do.
Go ahead.
Garry, how do you manage when you go into a church? Most churches and ministries, there's a fine line between psychological counseling and scriptural counseling.
Yes.
So how do you manage it or recommend to the church or ministry after you leave? If they don't have, I mean, there's a legality issue here.
Sure. That's a great question. So one of the things that we would recommend is that a church, if a church has not already done this, some have and some haven't, is you need to begin looking for who are the Christian counselors in your area, you know, and I would even go so far as to say, you know what, as a church, why don't you reach out to the Christian counselors in your area. Right. They would love to be connected to your church because they want referrals, understandably. Why don't you throw a meal for them, a lunch, and get to know them and let them get to know your church, but also have some time. It could even be, this would take some time to prepare for, but you could even have church staff meet with individual counselors and go through a series of questions, kind of interview them, go through a series of questions that you prepared in advance to get an understanding of where that counselor is coming from. There's counselors who are Christian, and then there's Christian counselors. And so I think it's really important that we understand that counselor is actually going to support the theological understandings of our church and not wind up leading somebody off in a different direction. So that's huge. It's always so important, you know, the whole idea and theme of do no harm. It's always so important to know as a Christian leader when we've kind of hit our maximum and we need to refer a person. And so that's something that, in a sense, it's case by case. But in another way, there are certain themes that can come up that you really recognize, yeah, this person does need to be referred. But even if they're being referred for professional counseling, you know, an hour of counseling a week is not going to be able to do all for them that they need. They need an environment in which they can be known, and so the counseling can be really helpful and important. But I do think also churches could. I used to lead and oversee our counseling ministry at this church when I was on staff for those 12 years, and so I'm also really happy to help give churches some direction and some advice on how do you develop a lay counseling ministry. Some, frankly, I think can do more harm than good. And so how do you develop that in such a way that people understand some of the idea of dual relationships and how to avoid those, and how to, how to minister and pastor. Pastoring is different than professional counseling, obviously. How do we walk with people and shepherd them in their areas of brokenness? Again, I think that's contextual, and we can work that out together. One of the resources that we recommend is the American Psychological, not the American Psychological, not that one at all. American, it's AACC, and now I'm drawing a blank. The American Association of Christian Counselors. That also has some really great teaching, lots of different videos and teachings that people can watch and then even take tests for, and get the results back, and can really help prepare people for helping others. So I think those are some of the basics, but we do need to be careful in this litigious culture that we are walking with wisdom and making the referrals that we need to make.
Right. Just curious on the senior leaders that are in our group right here, how many of you guys have, or ladies have, counselors that you refer your folks to? Just wave, or because that's really a good thing to fall back on. Any other questions? Go ahead, Greg.
Yeah, I have a question. First of all, thanks, Garry, for all that you're sharing.
Welcome.
You said early on that you believe that churches most relevant in our culture are standing on a razor's edge. There are a ton of cultural landmines that churches are navigating right now. Like, do we allow people to use their bathroom of choice? so many things like that. I'm dealing with
Yes.
something right now, a polyamorous relationship where
Yep.
a woman who's married wants to be able to have a relationship with other men. With the idea that we want to welcome everyone to attend our church no matter what, then know how to manage those landmines, where the line should be. It's a razor's edge, but where should the line be when we welcome people to attend the church? How involved should they be? Serving as leaders, working with the kids ministry, working on the ministry team. Can you describe what that razor's edge looks like in your opinion?
Sure. Those are phenomenal questions, which honestly, we could have a couple-hour conversation just about what you brought up, Greg. One of the things, so when I was referring to a razor's edge, what I was specifically referring to is this idea of walking in the tension of love and truth. Like, what does it mean? We don't have wide lines of demarcation these days in terms of, that we can kind of lean one way or lean a little bit the other and still be kind of, in the, I think in the flow of the Spirit and with what God's calling us to in our culture. When it comes to human sexuality and sexuality in general, it does seem like more and more we are standing on that razor's edge with, again, what is that tension? I think it's an important tension to live with, that we don't want to minimize truth, but we want to love extravagantly. One of our taglines is leading with love anchored in truth. So we want to embrace those things. And churches are definitely facing situations that are not in any way cookie cutter. One of the things that I would strongly recommend to every church leader listening is to go to Alliance Defending Freedom. They're actually based here in the Scottsdale, Arizona area, but go to their website, Alliance Defending Freedom, and they have a membership process, but more importantly, they have a PDF that can be printed off that helps you understand how to navigate as a church the nuances of some of the particular landmines that we are operating within as a church in our particular in our culture. So I would encourage you to get that information, even reach out to them for potential legal advice and things of that nature. Now that's on the one hand, right? We don't want to be driven by either in terms of loving people, obviously, or insurance companies would love it if nobody ever came to a church, because there would be no potential for someone to fall and break their ankle or whatever. But we need to not be driven by that or led by that. But I think when you're, for example, the question of what bathroom do they use? I think it's worthwhile to even install in churches a neutral bathroom that's simply a one stall. It's a one stall room. But the problem with that is that's not sufficient for a person who's trans identified. That feels to them like that does not accomplish for them what they're desiring. And they not only want to not use the bathroom of their biological gender, but they want to be able to use the other so that they feel more included in the other gender. Transgenderism is actually going to dwarf or overshadow homosexuality. The L and the G of the acronym. It's going to overshadow it for sure, I believe. And so we really need to know, how do we navigate that? How do we, for example, I know a church that really it's an inner city church, loves everyone, so glad that gay people are there, those that are married, those that are just together, that they're in an environment where they're hearing the gospel. They want them to continue. There's a guy that was coming out of a trans identity, but was in this stage of I'm not, I am, some days is coming wearing a skirt and 5-inch pumps, but looking like a guy with a beard, but wants to start serving in the church. And where's usually a first church? Where is the first serve opportunity in most churches? It's in the parking lot. It's at the door, right? Oh, sure, you can be a greeter. Well, without even thinking about it much, here they have this guy, not when he was in this phase of presenting as a man and re-embracing his biology. you know, they have him greeting. Well, there were days that he would show up and was greeting and he's wearing, you know, pumps and a skirt. And so then you have children also coming in, and of course families trying to figure out, how do I navigate this? And so there are all kinds of questions and issues. And I think we have to take into consideration the broader benefit of the body. I think we need to prepare our body well for, look, this is the world that we are living in. And so how do we become salt and light in very intentional ways? How do we, so churches that start to embrace the reality that we are a sexually broken congregation. We are relationally and sexually broken congregation. We are largely living in hiddenness, and that can no longer stand. We can't thrive as a church that way. We haven't been thriving as a church that way. And so when churches start to embrace this longing to go deeper, this longing to be loved and known, even in their most broken places, it starts to open the door for us to explain to people, hey, we need to find places where people can serve. We need to start equipping our children, because most children are going to the public school system and they're getting it at 5 and 6 and 7 years old. So how do we navigate as parents, not just to be put off by someone who's in our congregation as a gay man or a gay woman, or a gay couple or a trans individual? How do we navigate that and use brokenness as an example to our kids of the path that we don't want to go down? So Greg, I know that that's a kind of a rambling answer to your question, but again, that's why we're here. So I'd be happy to have a conversation, just by way of example, with you about some of the specifics that you're facing. I do think polyamory is a huge issue, and honestly, we need as churches to call people to repentance, and to do it in such a way that when we call people to repentance, but we're also talking about our sexual brokenness as a group and as a congregation, and that it's an entirely different thing for Christians to struggle with sin, to fall flat on their face, to get back up and go to the cross, to have their band of brothers or their band of sisters they're confessing to, and that they're moving closer and more toward Jesus. So in that sense, that person still sins. We all do. We fall down, but that's an entirely different thing than the person who's celebrating sin.
Right.
You know, so we can't lump them together and say, oh, we're all sinners, and so, you know, I guess that's just the way it is. No, we need to be struggling against sin. We need to be struggling together against sin, and embracing sanctification, and re-embracing really a call to repentance and authentic gospel.
Yeah, that's really just mind-blowing. Some of the stuff that's going on here, and just appreciate your insight. If you guys get on the Zoom group chat, there's some messages up there on Gary's website there on training, desertstreams.org, Living Waters. There's some more information about their ministry and exactly what they do, and a couple other messages on there as well from people just throwing some comments out there. Any other questions out there? We still got some time. Go ahead, Andy and Heather.
Yeah, I guess in my interactions with people that identify trans, homosexuality, that type of thing, it seems like it's often like, this is who I am. It's not just a, you know, this is what I prefer in my sexual life. It's like this is my entire identity. And so if you don't agree with that, then, you know, you don't agree with me as a person. And so how do you, like, getting past that whole, you know, and even some people that we know who are strong in their faith, you know, kind of come out and say, I've been struggling with this for years and years and years, and I'm done struggling. This is just who I am.
Right.
So, you know, I don't know if you can speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, I would love to speak to that last point first. So I know very much what it's like to grow up in the church and struggle with these feelings, these issues, and to get to a point where I'm just done. And that's what I did. I left Bible college And honestly, to be blunt, I mean, I just said, God, I hate you and I hate your church. I want nothing to do with this crap anymore. Nobody has any answers for me. Pastors don't know how to help me. And I'm done. I've been praying and praying to you to take this thing away for years and years, and you've not lifted one finger to help me. That's how I felt. And so when I left Bible college, I just thought, I'm done. I wound up finding my first gay bar a few months later, and very much by accident. And it felt to me at age 19 at that point, it felt like I'd finally found my people. And so it was very powerful. I was not open to anybody from the church saying anything to me about any of this at this point. And but here's the key thing, is that those of us who say, you know, I've been struggling with this for years and years and years and I'm done, the truth is we've not been doing it God's way. Mm-hmm. We've been struggling on our own. Maybe we've invited a couple people in, or maybe one person we've opened up and told something to, but they're really not equipped in any way to actually help us, and they have a clue of what to do. But most of us have actually just kept it to ourselves. And so to say I've been struggling with this for years and I'm done is actually not a truly authentic statement. Because when James 5:16 says, confess your sins to one another and pray for each other that you might be healed. And the truth is, none of us want that prescription. None of us we give us anything but that. And I understand that. I know that. And it's not just in the LGBT arena. So I understand the feelings that people have, that they're done. But the truth is, if we haven't done it God's way, if we haven't allowed community into our lives, if we haven't allowed the areas that God says is off limits, or areas that damage human flourishing, then and we've been trying to do this all on our own, we've been taking a wrong prescription. The other thing is, when it comes to this whole identity piece, this is who I am. So Greg brought up polyamory, and so this woman or guys that feel that way feel like this is a part of my orientation. Orientation is growing. It's this ever expanding thing, right? That there's talk about, and it's not brand new, but it's been fairly quiet. But we're going to see more of it. There's talk about even the idea of genetic orientation, that incest. That there's some thought about it being some kind of an orientation that actually is a part of a person. And so more and more, basically our sin becomes orientation. And I don't believe that I think the attraction, any draw towards sin that's a result of sin that was handed down to us through Adam and Eve. I mean, the fact that we live in a world that is saturated, really with sin. We have the devil and we have our own flesh. But I don't think that a person who has same-sex attraction, or a guy that is attracted to other women besides his wife, but chooses to navigate that well, chooses to be in accountability, chooses to honor God and his wife, or vice versa if it's a woman. I don't think that that person is sinning just because they have a pull and a draw. They're making choices. And the same thing would be true for someone like myself, who comes out of a exclusively same-sex attracted background. I had a young pastor once say that somebody had told him, look, I'm born this way. And his response was, and it wasn't snarky, it could sound this way, it could be delivered in a snarky way, but it wasn't for him snarky at all. I love the response, which is, that's awesome, because we all have to be born again. Every one of us have to be born again. So it doesn't matter how we were born. And I personally don't think that homosexuality is an inborn issue. I think there may be some things that are in a sense predetermined, but I don't think any of those are determinative. I think the main thing that we experience is the way that the environment that we grow up in, through our stages of development, and the way that we relate to that environment or the people in our lives. That has a huge impact on the possible development of same-sex attraction, or frankly misogyny or misandry, the devaluing or the hatred of the masculine or the feminine. I mean, we see these things modeled, but we experience unhealthy and broken environments. And so we can walk out of those environments feeling like, well, this is kind of who I am, or it is very much who I am. But again, the call is to follow what Christ clearly reveals to us, what the scriptures clearly reveal to us, and to surrender. It doesn't matter how much it feels like a part of who I am. we're still called to surrender in totality to the gospel, and to take up our crosses daily and follow after Jesus, to deny ourselves, right? I mean, literally in Luke, it says daily, deny ourselves, take up our crosses and follow after him. And we're all called to that. So that's where I start in that kind of conversation. I don't get in an argument as to whether someone's born that way or not, but who cares ultimately at the end. But the good news is I think it has a lot more to do with environment, and even Dr. Lisa Diamond, who's a lesbian researcher, if you Google her and Google Cornell University, around the 35-minute mark of that, it's worth listening to the whole thing. But she clearly says, her research on sexual fluidity absolutely debunks the idea that we're born this way, and it's immutable, it's unchangeable.
It's a lie that the enemy is thrown out there to really get a foothold.
And we've all bought it.
Yeah. Yeah. Corey, did you have a question?
Yeah.
Okay.
So I hear what you're saying on all this, and I think it's all very good, and I'm appreciating this. I think one of the challenges that I see has to do with, let's say we put out a list, a sign-up list. Hey, we're going to do a class on sexuality, or we're going to do a class on people who struggle with addictions, et cetera, et cetera. I don't want my name on that list.
Right.
Right. If, what did you say, 60, 70% of people in the church, or whatever that statistic was, struggle with pornography. Let's use that as an example.
Yep.
I think that flows right into our leadership, right?
Right.
That holds true, if not 60, 70%, probably somewhere close, of pastors struggle as well. So I'm a pastor of a church, let's say, and I want to go and approach this thing. No way I'm telling anybody that I'm struggling with this.
Right.
I don't want my wife to know. I don't want, if I'm not a senior pastor, I don't want my boss to know. I don't want, Pastor Joe to know if he's my leader, whatever it is. How do we go and open up that grace, I guess, because we're in that culture. How do pastors get help? How do we go and make it a point where being on that list, there's no stigma there, right?
Yep.
How do we open that door when no one wants to be on that list?
Nobody wants to be on, you're right, Corey. I mean, nobody does want to be on the list. It's like, you could have any number of, let's say after a church service, you're going to be doing small groups, and they all have kind of a different emphasis. And you have the group for bikers, and you have the group for, one thing or another, and you have the group for those dealing with pornography with a big sign. Nobody's going to go over there, obviously. It's the last place anybody wants to be, but in the place that nearly everybody needs to be. So one of the things I think this is going to take for environments to really shift is pastors have to get really courageous. And we have to, there's a pastor at a mega church in South Carolina called Grace Church, in Greenville, and he's very open about they've called Melissa and I in to do some training for their staff, and of course they have 10 churches, like 10 or 12,000 people, and we've gone there a couple of times to do some training. But he's very open about his past sexual or pornography addiction, and the fact that he still has, it's a past thing, but he's still vulnerable to it, and has accountability and software on his phone and a variety of things. But because he's so open about it, it gives everybody else permission to do the same thing. And so part of the problem, part of it is that we're scared to death to, we have all the what ifs in our mind of what could happen to us. We could get fired, our wife could leave us, or our husband could leave us. That's a possibility. Our kids, could find out and that could damage them. There's all kinds of what ifs of, what could happen. But I think we need to start weighing that against, what if we don't? We live in a culture that is going to hell in a handbasket, largely driven, by a lot of things, I know, but there's so much that's driving it from a sexual brokenness perspective, that pastors that will stand up and start to be known, and I don't mean you just stand up without anybody knowing about it. Your elders don't know, and if you're an associate pastor, your leader doesn't know, or if you're a senior pastor or whatever. We need to have these conversations so that leadership understands around the table. It's one of the reasons I love doing the leadership team meetings, is because when leadership understands and they're able to ask their hard questions and really kick the tires or whatever, then they go into these more public teachings and ministry times really engaged and ready to, like, they really buy into it. So in a culture that is desperate, I mean, frankly, it would be so refreshing to have some pastors in a particular city supporting one another and talking openly about, look, this has been a long-standing issue. I am walking in repentance. I do have accountability in my life. I think it's important to make sure that that's happening. You know, my wife and I are walking through this. We're doing some professional counseling. There's any number of things that can happen to kind of start the ball rolling. But if a church doesn't want you because you've had a pornography problem, let me say it this way. There's a huge difference between a pastor who's had a 20-year pornography addiction and maybe has slipped into some other sexual behaviors, and the church finds out about it some way because someone actually saw his computer or saw something that gave it away, and now he's lying about it, and then finally he fesses up. There's a big difference between that guy and the guy who comes forward and says, you know what, I've had this long-standing pornography addiction. I've been fighting it. I've been battling it. I need help and I need support. To me, a church that has that last guy as a pastor, man, they need to pour into that guy or that woman, and they need to get him or her the help that they need, and they need to bring that person, keep that person connected to the church, because that is going to be a powerful avenue through which God revives and brings vitality to that church in the arenas we're talking about. So also, one of the things that we do as a ministry, I don't do much with individuals, as I think I mentioned that earlier, but I do love to have conversations with pastors and even do some Zoom calls and walk with them through some of their own sexual struggles. Also, one of the things that was put up on the in the chat group when I talked about living waters, somebody actually posted, I can't remember who it was, but posted, the administrator, the desertstream.org website, the Living Waters tab. They do a week-long training 3 times a year. And by training, the last day is training. The other 5 days, you as a leader, you as a pastor and others go through the program, and you go through the rigors of what everyone else goes through in the 20-week program. So it is unbelievably powerful and transformational in people's lives. So the training can also be a great place for a pastor to go and be able to unload and share in a confidential setting without people in their church being there in the same group.
Would that be a good introductory foot in the door type thing to get your team? Because it almost seems like you need a team committed approach to this thing. To do it by yourself could be really risky.
Oh, absolutely. No, you're right, Mark. I mean, I think I've seen, so I went to my first Living Waters training in 2004. I was on staff at the church. I went by myself, which is incidentally where I met my wife. So any of you that are single out there, you might, but I went to, so in 2005, I talked to our leadership team, and there were 6 of us that went to the next training. Our senior pastor of a church of like 1,200 adults. I mean, it wasn't, you know, he didn't have a lot of extra time, but he chose to do that. Worship pastor, counseling pastor. We all went and felt like, you know, we've had this counseling ministry for years. We focused on spiritual warfare, but we have not really, in an intentional way, in a systematic way, had a program that addressed all the wounds that we're carrying. And so Living Waters is really all about that. And so, yeah, if you take your 3 or 4 or 5 people from your leadership team and go to this, and you go into different groups, so it's anonymous. People that are in your group sign confidentiality forms where you keep everything confidential. It's shared in the group, and your other people from your church are in other groups. But it's a great way of beginning the conversation or taking the conversation deeper and looking at, potentially at using Living Waters as one method for impacting the environment down the road in your church.
Cool.
So,
Corey, did you have any follow-up to your question?
Yeah, and I think that the last part you said makes a lot of sense. If you can have a reason for going other than I struggle with pornography.
Yep.
It's sign up, right?
Right.
And it's hey, it's leadership training, or it's maybe we have a men's year-long program where we deal with different issues, and one of them is sexuality. You know, I think that's going to be the way you get people to sign up.
Free food.
Yeah, I mean, if it's if they can be a part and say, yes, I'm willing to open that part of my life up, but I don't want necessarily everyone to know that I'm for this. I think that's a good way. I like the idea of like even like pastoral huddles, you know, where we intentionally tackle X number of topics, and this is one of the topics. No one's going to be like, okay, everyone will be willing to get on board with that because you're not really pointing them out.
Absolutely. Let me just say quickly in response to that, there was a Living Waters program that started in San Francisco many, many years ago. And the national coordinator of Living Waters now, Dean Greer, was a part of that group. And, when it was a new program for this particular church. And essentially what it wound up being is, you'd have people that met in the blacked out window room down in the basement, that nobody knew about. And you're very careful about not being seen going down there and that kind of thing to this particular program. Very much what you're talking about, Corey. I mean, but over the course of a couple of years, Dean was saying he was standing in the foyer area of this church, and a pretty large church. And before long, people were actually saying, hey, I got into Living Waters. When the environment starts to shift, and one of the things I would advocate for is, I think it's great to start off with a closed and confidential group, and where people can deal with their shame and can deal with the addiction, and can begin moving and growing out of that. But ultimately, the freedom lies. I lived in terror that people would know my background. And now I talk about it on stages I couldn't even care less. But because I know it gives God glory, ultimately, it's not my story, it's his story. It gives him glory and it gives others hope. And so there is so much freedom in getting to a place where I don't need to just stay in the blacked out room downstairs. I start there, and that's okay. That's a good place to start. But over time, I start to become more and more open. I start to become more and more known, because there are too many people who are desperate to hear, an average person or a leader even talking about their own personal struggles. So it not only gives other people hope, but it really gets to a place where who cares anymore? Like there's so much freedom in not even caring about who knows, that it doesn't matter. I mean, how can people use it against you if you're public with it anyway? And it doesn't start there, but ultimately I think that is profound freedom, when people can't use something against you because you're the first one talking about it publicly. So.
Hey, Gary, do you want to just give a little teaser for the next huddle in March 8th or 19th it is. It's going to be at 8 p.m. Because it's the night before our Youth and Kids Leaders Summit. And Gary will be here at Elim, so we're going to do it from our offices here. But if you could just give a little teaser to this, and if you guys would promote it and get the word out there to anybody that you feel would benefit from this. We got many people hiding in our churches that could really get some freedom in this area. Go ahead, Gary.
Okay, so honest disclosure, I can't remember what I mentioned to you as far as the second one, but let me ask you one other question. As we were talking here, one of the things that occurs to me, there's a one-page PDF that a ministry friend developed a couple of years ago, which has been so helpful. It describes the four main perspectives on LGBT issues within the church, not out there, but within the church. Everything from God's cool with gay sex to where I'm at, which is believing in transformational ministry, which, by the way, doesn't mean the eradication of all temptation. And then there's a couple of others in between. And some of them are really, there's a lot of confusion in the church around some of these issues and perspectives, I should say. And it really helps give some handles to pastors and leaders to understand the different perspectives and kind of who are some of the popular cultural figures that fit within those. I would be happy to go over that next time, but I can't remember, Mark, what I put down.
Yeah, you had mentioned something about understanding the factors in the development of homosexuality and transgenderism and how we engage our community.
Yeah, so I can do that as well, or that could be the third one. I
think both is good, and then the last one is more of the practical, but you can feel free to go in any direction that you want. I know we're a little bit over, but does anybody have a last question that they want to just ask Gary? We good? you guys appreciate this? Was this really helpful? Just some great stuff. And appreciate Gary.
Anybody can feel free to reach out to me.
Yeah.
My cell phone number, if you want to jot it down, is 607-3, so it's still a New York number, 607-341-1289. Feel free to call me or text me, or my email is just my first initial last name. So it's GINGRAHAM@loveandtruthnetwork.com. So feel free to reach out to me personally. Feel free to reach out to me to talk about, me coming and doing something with your church or whatever.
Yeah, Gary's going to make himself available to our Elim family here, and tap into him. I'm sure he can help you out, even there from Arizona, and then open the door to see what the Lord might do to bring him up and things like that. But Gary, so appreciate you and your heart. We look forward to seeing you here again next month.
Thank you.
Thanks everybody for joining. We also have a couple other huddles coming up real quick. My little quick commercial here. Carol Ball and Jody Seidler are going to be doing a 3-series women's huddle starting on March 10th, April 7, and May 5, all at 2 p.m. And then again, our next one with Gary is on March 19th at 8 o'clock. So us older folks, take your Geritol, whatever you need to do to stay up. But also just get it out, help us get the word out, because we want to expose the devil for who he is, a liar and a deceiver. And again, I thank you for being on, and just send any feedback if you have any, and we just really appreciate you being a part of the family. God bless. Hey, Gary, will you pray for us? I really wanted, not to drag out, but just really, this is a huge topic, and there's so many hurdles and so many things to overcome. Just pray for us here.
Yeah, Lord, I want to pray for us that even, especially for those of us who have LGBT loved ones, friends or family, and understand their struggle, and they're good people, and we care about them. Lord, I pray that you would help us to understand from your perspective what it means to love well. That we would really embrace the reality that to love well is actually to desire another's best, and to desire their best is in alignment with what you say. And so help us to shake off any sort of cultural and the embrace of more of a cultural perspective on love, which is affirming and just kind of anywhere somebody is, and help us, Lord, to really embrace that truer, more difficult way of loving others, and without judgment and condemnation, but with real compassion, but with truth as well. And so we just pray that you'd help us navigate that in our own circumstances. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. God bless you, everybody. Have a great rest of the week, and we'll see you soon.